All right, let us begin. I'm assuming that most of you are here and know something about business process, that word has some meaning to you. Before we actually get started, I'm kind of curious about how many of you are using some tool or tools in your business process work currently. Just show of hands, yeah? And how many of you are primarily using Visio? Yeah. How many of you are using something other than Visio? Yeah. Well, good. That means there's an awful lot of you who hopefully will get some value out of this, this presentation. I'm Maureen Haggarty. I'm a senior associate at KPMG, and I am in, we have lots of ways how we parse our work. I'm in the state and local government practice doing technology enablement work, which is things like system implementation, requirements. We get involved in procurement, IV&V, all sorts of stuff, PMO work, and so on. So we've had a lot of exposure to many of your organizations over the years. And we're hoping that this, this presentation will help you think about how you do your work in your agencies and departments in a little bit different way. And to help us, we have a wonderful well, he's one of my colleagues, if you will, from the Chicago office who leads our practice. So Todd, if you would introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Todd Lohr. I lead our National Business Process and Transformation Practice. So happy to be with you guys today.
Yeah. And he's the whiz here about the unique tools. I know how to do process maps like crazy, but he knows how to utilize really way more sophisticated tools. So we've been working with you for quite a while, and one of the things we certainly have noticed in working with the state is that almost all of our projects require some sort of business process work. And what we also know is that most of you are, as we saw here, still in the Visio world. And the industry around business process management has grown so dramatically that I think even with 2013, Visio is kind of left in the dust compared to what some of these other tools can do. Hope there's no Microsoft folks here. Okay. All right. So anyway, like any good consultant, when we talk about business process, we have a gazillion acronyms. And you probably have heard about BPM and BPA and BPR and BP this and BP that, but sometimes we use them the right way and sometimes we don't. They're certainly all related. We're going to do some focus around business process analysis, or BPA, and then we're going to talk, or Todd is mostly, going to be talking about how you can take business process analysis to a whole different level. So, Todd?
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, probably louder than Maureen. So as Maureen said, there's a lot of acronyms around this space. It's generally the world of process, as I like to call it. So everything from business process, process excellence, process-based transformation, BPM. Everyone hear the acronym BPM? That's been probably the most commonly used acronym to kind of holistically talk about the space that we're going to cover a little bit today. So before we get into more of the technologies that support the concepts around process, we'll give some examples of those, and then I'll talk about where I see the market going and what's the next generation, kind of the cool new stuff that's happening in this space. I'll give a little bit of a primer on just business process management in general. So BPM, as it's commonly referred to, is really more a management philosophy or management style that really looks at focusing on your processes. And it's really important to do so in order to drive high performance in your organization. So fundamentally, most organizations, what you do is through providing a process. It's everything that you work fundamentally. So being able to focus on those, analyze those, design, implement, automate where possible, it has a lot of value in organizations. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see what I call our process capability framework. So this is all the things process kind of pulled together from kind of strategy to execution. So the way I like to think about processes, you have to think about them strategically around the architecture. So what is the structure of your processes? We'll get a little bit more into this, but different levels of process. You have high-level processes all the way down to detailed workflow. How do you actually think about architecting those together? How do you think end-to-end across your organization organization or your agency for how those processes interact with one another. Your customers, your clients, kind of the different folks that you support from a state perspective. Who are those people and what do they want? How do you get them and meet those needs? Those are fundamentally a process. So it's really thinking strategically around that, and then getting into what I call kind of the next dimension, moving to the right, is the business process analysis and design. So this is the capability to document your processes, understand how those processes work, and do analysis of those processes. So a lot of typical analysis things, Lean Six Sigma. Right, so being able to look at your process, find waste, which is very much the focus of Lean. Six Sigma focuses more on quality and defects throughout those processes. But how do you design those processes in the most efficient way and do analysis of that? And we'll talk a little bit more around some of the tools that the market has beyond Visio, as Maureen alluded to, that can kind of help you do that in a better way. As we move now more to the right, the technology starts to shift a little bit. And this is where we get into more of the automation tool sets. So these are more, where some of the modeling tools have been around for several decades. This is probably more around from the last decade or so further. So that's what's sometimes called BPM or BPMS. So business process management systems. And so these are workflow automation tools. So is anyone working with a workflow automation tool? Something that's automating the processes. Okay, a few folks have some of those in their environment. So these are more of the workflow orchestrations or the integration tools. So these are the actual technology capabilities that sit somewhere in the middleware layer that are connecting either your mainframe or your source systems, your ERPs, and kind of the actual layers that people are using those systems, and kind of orchestrate the process, automation of notification. So, hey, this is now in your queue. You need to process this. Once you do it, it notifies the next person, kind of managing the workflow. So that's kind of the next generation of those tools, as well as the integration layers. And then the last piece that's typically connected with those are what we call the enterprise process performance management, or the EPM tools. And so those are, once you have that layer of technology that's managing the processes, it's the way to measure and monitor those processes, to be able to understand KPIs, how those processes are performing, and be able to drive continuous improvement based upon the performance of those processes. Two other things that you typically see in this space, they kind of run across that kind of strategy through execution lifecycle of your process. First is the enterprise process governance layer. So this is the concept of, at a strategic level, how do I understand and manage my enterprise processes? What a lot of organizations are doing, I see a little bit more in the commercial space or the private sector, is having process owners. So historically, companies have been organized around functional silos, right? So they're functional grouping of how they got work done. A lot of that based off the thinking of the Industrial Revolution, based upon limited technology, education at the time. That was the best way to specialize labor to get work done. Obviously, times have changed in the last century, and so this is a new way of thinking from a managerial construct about your enterprise, to think about those end-to-end processes that typically cut across many different functions within an organization. And how do you actually manage those to work together from an end-to-end perspective, not only in the performance, the actors that work in those processes, but also the technologies and how those technologies fit together as well. And then the last concept here is at the bottom, which is really the foundational support, which we see a lot of times as a better practice in a lot of leading organizations focusing on process, is having that process center of excellence, or the COE. And that's the group that is really coordinating the end-to-end processes, both strategically on how they design them, they model them, they execute and orchestrate them, as well as measurement and monitoring on the back end. And having that group of specialists that kind of pull it all together and be able to support this kind of thinking within the environment. Questions? Okay. So we'll take a little bit of a journey here through some of the acronyms and give you a little bit more background on that. One is BPA. So BPA is Business Process Analysis, sometimes referred to as Business Process Analysis Suites. So these are those next generation process tools that Maureen's going to drive into more detail on, that really lets you understand your architecture, improvement, process analysis, process modeling. A lot of them are object-oriented, meaning they have relational databases in the back end. So it's not just a picture of a process, it's actually a relational database that lets you do a lot of interesting things around around analysis of those processes, simulate those processes. So those are the things that kind of help you get a lot more out of how do you use those processes. Some of the other trends we're seeing in this space is the concept of social process. So being able to have these tools with almost like a Facebook capability where you can like and social collaborate around processes. I'm not seeing a lot of organizations liking each other's processes yet, but that's one of the concepts that these tools are starting to build in. So much like you have a Facebook page where you see your friends and you talk to them, and so I hear, I'm not a Facebook person, but familiar with the concept. You would have the same thing for your process, right? So as an enterprise process owner, you would have a page where people could comment on the well-being of your process, make improvement recommendations. So that's kind of this social BPM is another kind of concept that we're seeing more and more of in the marketplace around that. So really BPA is a little different from BPM, BPM being the broader construct. But then if you think about kind of that continuum from strategy to execution that we talked about for the enterprise capability model, there's really the two technologies that are primarily in the market, I'll get it right one of these times, is the process analysis suites. So those are the BPAs. Those are really going to help you do kind of the first pieces around the enterprise strategy, the process documentation, and the analysis. And then the business process management suites, or the BPMS, are going to be more of the workflow tools that help you orchestrate and actually implement those processes. Many of the vendors that you'll see in the market today have both sides of this. So they have integrated product sets where they will have a tool. So Software AG is an example. They have a tool called Eris, which is a process analysis suite that lets you model and improve your processes. And then it can take that process definition to Web Methods, which is their integration and implementation suite, where it actually will take that blueprint, have you kind of work through the integration layers and kind of the actual more detail around the requirements, and actually have an implementable code coming out of that for you to actually manage that end-to-end workflow. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Maureen. She's going to go through some more examples specifically around BPA and how you can get use out of it.
So as you're looking at this, please don't have your eyes roll up in the back of your head going, oh, that's the problem with business processes. You can't understand them. One of my favorite quotations about business process modeling is that the only person who can read a process map is the person who made it. So one of the reasons that there's value in enterprise versions of process modeling is that you create a reference and a structure and a framework and protocols and standards that can be applied across the organization so that there can be understanding and familiarity with all of the processes regardless of where you are in the organization. We certainly have seen in our work with the agencies and departments that one department will do their processes one way and one department will do their processes another way. And if you looked at them, you couldn't tell which shapes did what, or swim lanes made what sense or anything. And their notations and their connections and what have you can all vary. This kind of thing provides some discipline to how the organization will develop process flows so that everyone who's working with them can figure them out, and it isn't a case of what we see now. So in looking at this, one of the cool things about this, let's see if I can get this laser to work. I don't know. I'm sure it's working, but I don't know where it's, well, anyway, it's a big picture. The intent here is to show that with these kinds of tools, and this is an example from Eris, is that you can, because there's a hierarchy associated with the tools, you can do a certain amount of decomposition of a process through the organization by, in truth, just clicking until you get down to a much lower level. And what this is intended to demonstrate is from a financial accounting process.
Those are finances.
Yeah, finance. That you could get down to much lower levels of actual processes that people are doing and not just how it fits in the enterprise level. At the same token, you can go back up, roll it back up, and see where it fits into the big picture. So it's from my perspective, it's a really cool thing. It's like a version of an org chart, but with processes. And you can see how they fit together and how they cross from one area to another. The other cool thing about this is that it allows you to, because it's a relational database, it allows you to look at the various objects relative to each other. So you could look at one team leader and find out which processes that team leader touches in any way, shape, or form, or what applications that team leader is using across all processes and across the organization. So when you set up these kinds of tools, it gives you a way to look at how your enterprise processes are really integrated in a whole different way. And it gives you means of doing some analysis about what's effective and what's not effective that wouldn't be readily apparent if you were just looking at a Visio process flow or just the process map itself, even if it was one of these. So it's the linkages that are the pretty important thing here. So if we then look at sort of dealing specifically with, for BPA, what these tools can do in a sort of a summary way, it lets you compare, which means if you set up an as-is process map and you set up a to-be process map, you can actually generate a report that will show you the differences between them. If anybody in here does system implementation work, yeah, and you're doing to-be analysis and it's like, okay, where are we at problems? This is the kind of thing that can really help you figure out what you got today and how it's going to change tomorrow. And then it gives you an opportunity downstream to deal with things like training and service delivery to understand what those variations are. It also allows you to simulate models. So you can set up a process, and if you put in enough information, you can actually run the process, and you can see how long it ought to take relative to how long it might actually take. And you can also make changes to the variables and see what impact it has on the process. So it's just one more really cool thing. You can obviously do the queries and ad hoc analysis that we sort of talked about on the previous slide, where you would take, even if you went at it backwards, look at a particular application and want to see all the places it's being used, or looking at a person and seeing where everything aligns. It allows you to do that, and then of course there's tremendous analytical data that you can extract as well. And finally, you can calculate models, or you can set up models to calculate things around time, cost, capacity, and those are all functions that can be done inside the tool. Now, of course, the proviso here is you've got to enter some data. You know, remember that old garbage in, garbage out? Or if it's like no data out. So it does take some effort to make sure you set the thing up so that you can actually take full advantage of it. And I think, one more for me, yay. So one of the things we wanted to talk, well, before I leap into this, anybody questions? We'll have time at the end as well. We're good? Okay. So one of the advantages at a very high level for doing this is that it allows an agency or department or any organization to really begin managing and measuring how its processes actually support the organization, from the bottom up or from the top down. And when you're here, as many agencies and departments are, you have taxpayers and a client base that you need to serve, and you're dealing with taxpayer dollars. You want to make sure you're being the most efficient and effective about the use of those dollars. This can give you a way to get a clearer line of sight about how you are actually expending your time and effort and spending those dollars. It obviously will help you understand how processes interact in your systems across the board. It'll help you find process flows, or flaws. We used to always talk about bottlenecks. Now we have flaws, but you know what we mean, where things aren't going as smoothly as you expect, that there's a step here that takes longer than it should, or gets missed, or whatever. You can identify those, and then you can drill down and start addressing them. You can obviously evaluate which activities truly are of value to your organization. I bet you have days when you look around and you think, why are we doing this? Because you can't see any value to it, and this would be a way to help you figure out whether or not it actually does provide value. It might surprise you that it does, or it might give you a way to say, need to rethink that. And obviously, at its heart, when we talk about business processes, we're talking about trying to do things quicker, better, faster, better. And this is a way to help you do that by streamlining and by improving how things move through your organization, whether it's through people or through systems or across departments, or how you use your internal email, or even for communicating with workflows. And it hopefully will improve efficiencies. Better yet, as I said, you'll have a consistent messaging through the organization because the view will be the same and the frame of reference can be the same. And it obviously can help support a whole lot of other things like development, inspection and testing, whether we're talking about system development and inspection and testing, or we're talking about materials testing. So there's lots of ways to apply processes. And finally, with your rules engines that are associated with these things, you can often make sure that you're in compliance. Always a big issue when lots of things change on a regular basis from a regulatory standpoint. Okay, any questions? No? Okay, we're going to have Todd talk about the future.
Thank you. So this is my favorite part, to kind of talk about what we see coming next in the marketplace. So before I get to that, I'll kind of go through a historical perspective of the concepts of business process management. Some of these I alluded on a little earlier this afternoon. So there really was kind of the first wave of thinking about process really started with the Industrial Revolution, although it's very different how that's evolved. You know, in the 70s, you know, actually even with Deming in the 50s, you started seeing more different thinking around continuous improvement, some of those concepts. That's when Six Sigma and Lean started really taking hold. And those continue to today, right? So I still see a lot of organizations just starting to embark in quality programs, doing Lean Six Sigma, where they may have done it in the past, but you know the world has changed so much, they're going back and they're relooking at their processes and driving more continuous improvement. In the 90s, you saw a lot of work by a professor, Michael Hammer, from MIT. He wrote a book called Reengineering the Corporation, which was really focused on getting rid of functional organizations and really looking at end-to-end processes, more radical change, reengineering the company, those kinds of concepts. Then Peter Fingar wrote a book kind of early in the 2000s called The Third Wave of BPM, which this somewhat references. So that third wave really referenced a lot of the workflow capabilities that were coming online. So it was not just let's model and let's improve our process and then throw it to someone in IT to go out and build something that looks like that, but actually how do we integrate how we build technologies so that it's based in processes. So actual model through execution was the real concept there. And that's those BPMS, or those business process management systems I referred to earlier, where you actually model the process and it performs how you model it in an integrated closed loop so that you actually can get kind of that view into how your process is going to perform based upon how you're designing it. What we're seeing now is kind of the next iteration of things within the process world, and a couple different things out there. One is really more integrated transformation thinking. So not just around your processes, but really taking those concepts to solve much larger, complex issues for today's organization. So, you know, the rapid change in regulations, the regulatory environment, there's a lot more stuff coming that are hitting organizations that's forcing large-scale change. And so focusing on those processes to be able to help accelerate that change, both from a design all the way through the execution. The second thing, which is probably my favorite, is cognitive computing and artificial intelligence, and that next generation of process technologies that are really looking at full automation based upon artificial intelligence and cognitive automation, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. And the last thing is the continued focus on process organization. So you're seeing more and more organizations they haven't gotten rid of the functional view of how they think about things, but they really have created matrixed organizations. So a process owner, as well as functional owners at the executive level, that are thinking both end-to-end about those processes and making sure that those are working well, as well as the functions that have been historically around for years. So let's talk a little bit about this concept. One more acronym for you. This space loves acronyms. Robotics Process Automation is the next generation of process automation. It's really the emerging set of a couple different capabilities that I'll get through in a second, and technologies that essentially is looking at automating knowledge work. So a lot of the work that folks are doing, a lot of this is happening specifically today in a lot of the outsourcing arrangements that we see globally. A lot of the work that historically had been outsourced or offshored is now being automated in very large waves. And a lot of that is from not just a single set of technologies, but as I'll get to in a second, it's a number of different technologies that are coming together to create this play for us to be able to automate a large piece of work. A lot of the RPA technologies that we see today are automating very basic tasks. So a lot of swivel chair processing, a lot of cut and paste, a lot of stuff that we're working with our clients on. They have, the 30-year-old mainframe. How many? You guys have some mainframes, old systems out there? Yes? Okay. So they haven't really gotten away from those because it's just been so hard for them to be able to build something to replace that. So what they've done is they've either put middleware on top of it, they've kind of masked those mainframe technologies, or they've just hired a lot of people to be able to kind of do some of those tasks that they haven't been able to capture from a technology perspective. What a lot of the automation tools today are doing are very unintrusive, so they sit in the desktop environment, which is a very different shift than what you'd see previously with some of the automation tools, where you actually had to get in and build all these architectural layers. This is really more of advanced macros that sit in your desktop. So you install it on the desktop, and it can learn from how you do your job. It can find patterns, and then it can do your job for you in certain pieces. So very sophisticated macros. The screen scraping capability has gotten much better. We're doing a lot of projects with some clients today where the basic task is they get an email that comes in. They have to go through and get 5 pieces of information from that email, go to 3 different systems, enter 5 different values, go to another system, send back an email, go back to a queue, and say that it's done, right? So it sounds like a typical process that you guys see. So that was something that we were able to do in the desktop layer with an RPA tool to automate that task, and now that bot, her name is Sassy, the client actually named her. They're trying to make the bots human, so if they feel better about them doing the work. So Sassy now sits and runs 24/7, performing that activity in an automated fashion. And that, instead of taking a long time to do, that was something that we built in 2 weeks, tested in a week, and had in production within a month. Right, so start to finish. And that client currently is doing that over and over again. So, in the last 6 months, they have, 20 different SASEs that they've built, and they're able to do that, and they're able to scale these things. And that's just some of the more basic, what we call class 1 technologies. What we see the market going to is the more purely cognitive technologies. So these are things like Watson. Everyone heard of IBM's Watson? Very interesting, right? So think of what Watson could do. Watson won Jeopardy, right? Because it could go out, it could understand what you were saying. It could go look at a bunch of unstructured data. It could make inferences, and it could return a value, right? So imagine applying Watson to how we do our work, right? And a lot of the jobs that people do, and being able to take that technology and the technology is increasing in its capability. The cost of that technology is coming down. So within the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a lot more of this type of automation. So a lot of leading thinkers in this space are really calling this the next big thing since the Industrial Revolution for how it's going to impact us socially, economically, just more broad based. So in the bottom here, not to scare folks, but this is going to be a big impact. And personally, I think this is probably going to be the largest thing I'm going to see in my career as far as what I'm doing and what's going to be impacting how we do work today. There's analysts that are predicting that within the next decade, it's about equivalent of 230 million jobs, or $9 trillion. Will have the capability to automate. So obviously that has not only the interest of how you're actually going to do that within an organization if you start automating that work. And in some industries, it's great because in some cases, the work hasn't gone away. The labor force has been drastically reduced due to cost pressure. So this actually is going to help alleviate some of that pressure. And in other industries, it's going to create a lot of changes in how they do the work and how they support that. So I'll talk a little bit about what we see the technologies doing in this space and how we're classifying them. So this is very much an emerging market in these technologies. The stuff we talked about earlier, the business process automation, the business process management tools, those are considered what I consider a tier 1 or a class 1 technology. So those, and some of that is still like the macro-based applets, screen scraping, basic workflow, BPM tools, process mapping. Those are the kinds of things that are kind of the more basic stuff. That market is fairly mature at this point. A lot of companies and a lot of organizations and agencies are getting a lot of value out of using those types of technologies. The example I gave is a perfect example of that. So pretty quick, pretty scalable. A lot of these are cloud-based solutions. So it's not an infrastructure play. It's not a huge shift in your organization. If you have a credit card, you can go out. I don't think your IT department's going to want you to do this, but go out and start automating stuff on your desktop pretty easily, which is an interesting paradigm compared to some of the workflow automation of the last decade, where it was Still a lot of value, still a great way to automate some of the work that was happening amongst our legacy applications, but a lot less lift and a much faster ROI on that. As we move to the right then, we start seeing more and more cognitive capabilities. Kind of the next space is adding really that processing of structured and unstructured data and being able to create and use a knowledge base. So where we're seeing some of this happen today is in call centers, where if you're on the phone with someone, they're actually, a cognitive solution is actually returning how they should be answering the question and being able to build to that knowledge base. So one of the advances here is some of these tools can actually watch you work and then learn the patterns or create the knowledge base. So it'll say, hey, I don't know how to do this. And then, okay, I'll do it for you. It's watching you do that, and then the next time that situation happens, it doesn't need to ask you because it built a knowledge base that it can then handle that scenario or that pattern of work in the future. We're seeing a lot more of the call centers using automation everywhere from just kind of basic automation all the way to kind of the pattern that I'm sure you all are seeing, which is the virtual agents, right? So I would say in chat, how many of you use chat as kind of a digital channel, right? United.com, so Ask Alex, for example, that's not a person that you're chatting with. That's Alex is a robot. Aetna, right? A lot of large companies, the people you're chatting with is actually a robot. A couple different software providers out there are supporting that. And then if it comes to something more complex, it will seamlessly put it to a person. And sometimes it'll say, hey, I don't know how to do that. Let me get Bob. And Bob's an actual person sitting somewhere. Or you may not even know that, right? If you go back and forth with the bot's like, I don't know what to do. They'll send it to a person, right? So that's kind of the advance we're seeing in contact centers is the automation. I would say the voice recognition and the pure virtual agent that you call in. So think about if Siri was just a little bit better. You would call and talk to Siri in the call center, which is a step above kind of a lot of the VO, kind of the virtual, press 1, press 2, press 3. Personally, I just press 0 and start yelling until somebody picks up the phone that has a heartbeat. So I think what you're going to see in the virtual, in kind of the virtual agent from a contact center perspective, you're still going to see mostly in chat, in the digital channels, the web self-service, more cognitive capabilities. But then within the next several years, you're going to see those voice agents getting much more sophisticated and much better. Some of the voice call-ins now are much better than others. They're actually, it's more natural language. So, hey, how can I help you versus please, listen for 3 hours to your list of 20 things, and I forgot what number 1 was by the time I'm on number 4, so I push 0. Right? So those are going to evolve as well to the point where there is going to be much more virtual pieces of that. And then, getting way out there into the cognitive space is really where you start thinking about artificial intelligence. And this is where concepts like Watson come in. And this isn't just, like I said earlier, this isn't just a single technology, but an actual set of a number of technologies that are coming together to provide these types of capabilities. So natural language processing, the ability to understand text, be able to speak, and interpret text. They're actually starting to figure out how to interpret feelings. So it's starting to get more and more into that realm of HAL. And then for later generations, Terminator movies, right? Okay. I can make generational references to the automation that's coming. My wife seems to think as I talk about this at home, someone's going to come from the future to kill me. So she's a little paranoid at this point. But I'm not doing anything. It's more call centers that I'm automating at this point, so no national defenses as of yet. But I'm sure our government, the federal and many state governments are starting to think about some of these technologies as well. So this is, some of the things that are happening in this space. So Watson is doing some work with Johns Hopkins where oncologists are wearing kind of Google glasses while they're operating, and it's taking images of the tumor and it's telling the surgeon where to cut based upon going out and getting trillions and trillions of images and historical success rates based upon how they treated that. And that's in like 2 seconds returning that. So applying those types of concepts, the way Watson was able to win Jeopardy by going out looking across all unstructured data that it can find to return a data set, it can do that for a lot of other professionals. So think of lawyers. That's kind of also, any lawyers in the room? That's another, sorry. Hopefully you're retiring sooner or later, yeah. So that's another profession that is much speculated as far as big shift in how that changes. Not trial lawyers. You're not going to have a robot up there in front of the judge, but a lot of the legal work behind the scenes is really going through a lot of information, depositions, structured and unstructured information, and applying logic to that, right? And so that's the kind of stuff that is being looked at today. A lot of law firms are investing in these things heavily as far as automation. So that's kind of where the market is going. So it's kind of interesting where it's been and kind of definitely where it's going, and some of the technologies that are there. I like to look at it holistically around how you automate your technology. One of the things that we see a lot of our clients doing, they're not, you don't just run out and say, I'm going to go get Watson and solve world hunger. You really start more basically thinking about your process, and then how do you automate pieces of that, and then how do you kind of use that knowledge and that investment to kind of build over time into larger capabilities to be able to do process from end to end. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left that we wanted to have questions. If you guys have any questions for us on anything related to.
I also would guess that there are some of you who would like to know, what does it cost to do some of this stuff? So Todd, maybe you can address that.
Well, as a good consultant, I'll tell you it depends. So from a business process analysis, the process analysis suites, those costs can vary quite a bit. And what we're seeing pretty much all of these tools moving to is more of a pay-as-you-go cloud-based offering, especially a lot of the process analysis suites. So you're paying by user, by month. That can range from $20, $50 per user per month. So really relatively easy price points. Historically, where you had to actually buy a server to install and then a bunch of desktop licenses, you were talking kind of 6 figures just to kind of get a few people going. So the great thing here is now you actually have the cloud that you can start getting some interest, start doing some stuff at a very low price point. And then the automation tools are the same way. A lot of them are, obviously can do on-prem. Some organizations prefer that and want to keep those things on-prem. But even the automation tools themselves tend to have kind of pay-as-you-go, either by volume or by number of users, depending on what you're automating. And those can range, in the same kind of range, $50, $100 per user per month. Depending, a lot of times it depends on scale, volume, right? You can do, onesie, twosies is obviously going to cost you a lot more than enterprise licensing.
Right. So if you have a starting point, let's say you decide you want to proceed with this, whether you decide to set up a center of excellence or you come up with a strategy, what are some of the first steps that you would typically take?
So typically, I like to solve, specifically to like business process analysis, so documentation of processes. I don't like to just go out and capture process. I always like to look at it, what are the major, challenges that your organization is facing? So what are kind of the burning platforms that your group is looking at? Kind of go back to your agency strategy, what you're trying to do, kind of what what's top of mind in your organization, and then really work from there. So use across any of the tools, right? So across whether it's just to model and analyze those processes, kind of focus on the burning platform to make sure that you can show the value out of it, and then kind of get more. It's kind of a multiplying effect. You can't just go out and say, I'm going to do business process and do it holistically, because there's a lot of cost associated to that, and you're not going to get organizational buy-in. So I call it stractical BPM, where you kind of strategically know where you want to go with some of the cool stuff that I showed you, but tactically you have to address it very, very tactical, very value added with every piece of work that you do, kind of focusing on kind of mission critical items in your agency.
Okay, any questions from you?
Yes. Okay.
The last part that you talked about, the robotics,
Mm-hmm.
how does the companies monitor that the artificial intelligence is providing the right responses?
Yeah, so that's actually, the governance of that is something that we're just starting to address more and more of in our organizations where we've done that. It depends on the actual bot and how cognitive it is. You still need to have some kind of QA function that's checking on the return values. And also, what is also an actual interesting paradigm is if some of the self-learning bots, you have to make sure it's learning from the right people. Because if you just put it in your organization, be like, here, watch Sally, and Sally doesn't know what she's doing, then pretty soon you have a bunch of embedded knowledge that the bot has captured that is not accurate. So. Yeah, yes, it can be. So you can still, you can govern it. What we're doing now with one of our clients that has several bots in production, we have kind of mining scripts where we're looking at expected results. And we're using actually a lot of data and analytics to address what we think the outcome should be and then applying that. So using large data scripts and analytics to be able to automate that and then pop up any issues that we think we're seeing, kind of a continuous self-monitoring environment. One of the other cool things we're doing with that client, just since I'm on the analytics topic, is they have timestamps based upon how people are interacting with systems across the organization. So we pulled those trillions of data sets and then found, we used kind of analytics to find out like algorithms of here are repeatable patterns that people are doing across the enterprise to say here's what we want to go automate. Because sometimes when you ask a very large organization, okay, what do we want to automate today? They're like, I don't know. Right, so we kind of took a very analytic approach to that, which is kind of another cool use of big data and analytics to be able to understand how work is being done in your organization for how you can automate that work.
The second really doesn't have to do with the IT industry, but I just have a question regarding it. I know Royal Caribbean Cruise Line now have robotic bartenders. Was this
Yes.
type of stuff used for something like that?
Yeah, so it is. I usually start, and I forgot to do this, I usually start my spiel with, I'm going to talk about robotics, but not the physical kind, right? Because everyone gets more excited about those. That is actually a huge play as well. As the kind of work that I do with mostly corporations, it's focused more on kind of what I call the knowledge worker automation or the knowledge worker bot. But physical robots is having a huge impact as well. So that's a great example. Lowe's is another example. They're piloting, the gentleman that I joke with my father who's retired, he's not going to have that opportunity to walk around and work at Lowe's anymore because it's now a bot that can follow you around. It can sense where you are, can say, hey, can I help you? And you say, where are the plumbing supplies? You don't really need to train that. That's a pretty straightforward algorithm. Now, what's the best way to caulk my bathroom? It might not be able to figure, but at some point it will, right? But then there's also, there's a whole social, right, and thankfully I have a philosophy degree, so which is kind of the interesting side of this. There's a huge social ramification of, how we humanize kind of this automation component. And generationally, how are people going to accept it, right? I told you, I dial 0 if I hear anything this is what I do for a living, and I dial 0. So there's a lot, there isn't necessarily going to be the acceptance too, right? So that's going to come over time. So although the technology, my guess is the technology is going to outpace the social acceptance of some of these things, right? Because you still want to, at the end of the day, we're people, and people are people, and we like other people. Well, most of us do. I do, most of the time.
I think we have time for maybe one more. Is that right, timekeeper? We got time for one more?
I got 3 minutes left.
Okay.
He's got 1 minute.
Yeah, one.
He's speeding up our clock. That's not fair. Yes.
You said the new tools are, in general, are less invasive.
Yes.
Can you, I'm trying to get my head around
Yeah.
exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate?
So specific to some of the robotics automation tools, it's like putting something on your desktop. So you're not going to IT and saying, okay, let's go into, if you think of your architecture kind of as layers, and here's kind of the workflow layer that you're actually, the desktop layer that you're looking at versus kind of all the mainframes. So you actually had to go code and build automation. This actually you install on your desktop, and it works like a macro on your desktop. So you can watch it like you can watch the bots working, right? So we've created virtual environments, bot farms is what we're calling them, where they're working. So I don't have a monitor hooked up, but I've created a virtual desktop for every one of our bots, and they're actually going out and they're doing the work. So if you plugged a monitor into them, you would actually just watch them like flip, flip, flip. So you'd see emails, you'd see things popping in and out like that.
So if something goes wrong,
Yes.
where there's an incident,
Yes.
what
Yeah.
happens?
So we have a bot farmer for the bot farm, right? So that's for those worried about job security, right? It's not all lost when you're replaced by a bot. You can become a bot farmer. These aren't industry terms, right? This is what we personally, I think it's kind of, I'm from Iowa, so I like the concept of the bot farm with the bot farmers.
So walk it through. There's an incident.
Yeah, so there's an incident, so there's,
So can we just get a time check here, because I don't know if they're going to cut us off.
all right, I'll wrap it up with here. So yeah, so there is, it can tell you when something did not perform as it expected, right? So it will flag up to the bot farmer, he'll go investigate it, he or she, and then we'll resolve that. So just like any other incident management, although we built a bot to automate the incident management. We can talk about that over a drink. That's the cool stuff. So, all right, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much.